Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Track 4 and the Podcast Summit. My name is Remi. I work for NRK in Norway, the Norwegian broadcast company, where I'm head of podcast in the central region of Norway. I'm glad to be a part of Radiodays Europe, and I am going to be with you for the next segment in the Podcast Summit. This segment is called Best Practices, and we will learn about other people's success and maybe some mistakes. There will be 3 speakers, and we'll have a Q&A after they have spoken. The first speaker is Meera Kumar. Welcome.
Thank you. Hi everyone, my name is Meera. I am a freelance producer and content development exec, so I work for clients all around the world. Just so you have like a 30-second idea of who is in front of you and why I know what I know. I actually learned how to make audio on YouTube and like random blogs, and that may not seem very reassuring, but then I graduated and my degree was in something completely different as well, Mandarin and economics. But I ended up being hired through like a scheme for underserved communities called Multitrack in the UK, and ended up being hired by some of the biggest production companies in the UK to produce their flagship shows. And I would say that was 50% luck and 50% there being a podcast boom and people needing people to make work. But since then, so I would say in the past 18 months/2 years, I've won a number of awards, including being named one of the Radio Academy's 30 Under 30, the best entertainment producer in the Audio Production Awards, a rising star in the British Podcast Awards, and a few other awards for my shows. And I need this. On the screen are a few of the shows I've made, and it will make sense why I'm showing this variety as we get into the talk. But I have made some traditional narrative stuff, like Big Spender, which was a 6-part series about Hong Kong gangsters, but was actually a story about geopolitics, China and Hong Kong. And I've also made things on the other end of the spectrum, like branded podcasts for a supermarket called Waitrose in the UK, where we had a Michelin star chef cooking food on set, serving food, and then after that it was pretty much like an interview show. But we've got stuff like Throwback Throwdown, which we filmed in a boxing gym, and was like a sound clash to introduce music to old music to younger audiences. And what we would do is we would give them funny scenarios, like you have to DJ at your ex's wedding. What song do you play as they're walking down the aisle? What song do you play for their first dance? What song do you play when someone objects at the ceremony? So it was kind of like a fun way to bring music to people in like a slightly unconventional kind of gamified concept. And then we've got stuff like Fern Cotton's Happy Place app, which is like a well-being app for which I recorded and put together sleep stories and meditations and sound baths, ASMR, and that sort of thing. So quite varied. And it ties into what I'm talking about, which is in the UK, we're kind of in this moment of change. The audio is in a state of flux, and that has meant that a lot of people have lost their jobs, both in the UK and in the US. Big productions that we thought were really popular and listened to by a lot of people have been axed, and companies have been shut down. And without wanting to minimize how difficult that has been for the people involved, I want to talk to you today about what I see as an opportunity, like a little nugget, a little kernel of something exciting that we can kind of pull out of this moment in time. For a while now, the audio industry in the UK, I've noticed there's been a bit of creative stagnation. And by that, I mean that a lot of people will come to me and say, I've seen this show and it's doing really well in the charts, and I want to make a show like that. They just want to copy and paste the format, the idea, even sometimes the artwork looks very similar. And as a producer, obviously, we can't do that. But it made me realize, once I'd seen this so many times from companies and individuals and even young producers, that it's very easy to see something do well and just want to replicate it. But it's causing this stagnation. It's causing us to see a lot of the same shows or very similar shows in the top 50, the top 10 podcast charts. And I think that it's actually a problem. And I think that with the flux that we're experiencing in audio, now is actually the time for us to try something different, for us to be ambitious, to develop ideas that kind of break the mold of what we thought audio is. And I think now is the time for us to push the medium forward. I don't think it's been pushed forward in a little while. There have been these really noticeable and really clearly identifiable moments in the industry, in the history of podcasting, where we can say, wow, podcasting massively grew then, or wow, podcasting really changed because of these shows or these ideas. And I think now is one of those moments. So, what I want to talk to you about today is one possible solution or one possible method for pushing the medium forward and kind of breaking away from that creative stagnation. And that is formats. So I'll give you an idea of one format so you can have that in your head whilst I talk to you about why formats are important. I don't know if it's big here. I'm not sure where everyone in the audience is from. But in the UK, we have something called Desert Island Discs. You guys, put your hand up if you know that show. OK, great. A lot of you do, a lot of you don't. Basically, it's a program in which, a radio program, in which someone, a guest will come on the show, and they will give you stories about their life through a luxury, a book, and 8 songs, I think. And it's the same for every guest. All that changes is the guest that comes on. Formats, with that in mind, do 3 really cool things. The first one is they take what might be a mundane topic or a predictable, interview, and they squash it or they package it into something really exciting, this surprising form. 2, they kind of breed the sense of familiarity with your audience. When someone tunes into Desert Island Discs, they know exactly what they're going to get every single time. They may not know the guest, but they know how the interview will run, and they know what they're going to hear. And 3, that means that people will come back to your show because they feel this predictability. And a lot of the time people think, predictable is bad. And yes, in some instances it is. But it can also be a really good thing because the human brain is constantly trying to figure out what happens next. Like you're watching a movie or you're reading a book and your brain is subconsciously going, well, like, who did the murder? Or what is this person's motivation? Or what really happened on that night? Formats kind of take the guesswork out of it for your brain and allow you to focus on the content. And I think that can actually be really satisfying. So formats are useful. We're going to look at a couple of very common formats. So on the left, we have conversational shows. These are 3 that have been massive in the UK. 2 of them are UK podcasts, 1 is a US podcast, but it's very popular. The very top one, I don't know about swearing, so I'll just say SHITS and Gigs is a show that blew up maybe 2 years ago on TikTok and social media and like absolutely just got catapulted into fame. These 2 guys are friends, they sit down, they've got 2 mics and they just chat. They chat about Reddit comments or tweets. They chat about how people have responded to like a scenario. And so there's a lot of audience engagement. I think people really like that. But a chatty show. Call Her Daddy is a US podcast, I think, acquired by Spotify. And it's absolutely massive. It's an interview show. You've got 1 host, 1 guest, and she asks some questions. And then the Receipts podcast was probably one of the very first shows that I listened to. It originally had 4 hosts, so kind of like a panel group chat podcast. Now has 2, but again, it's similar to the top one in that they kind of chat about everything and anything. Now, I see a lot of shows, generally celebrity-fronted shows or influencer shows, or ideas that are brought to me with people saying, like, can you make this? They're generally this kind of format, chatty shows, like, I want to talk to my friends about everything and anything that I'm curious about. There's nothing wrong with that. I think there is like a time and a place for it. I think they can be wildly popular. They're fairly easy to make, but there can actually be more interesting ways of delivering the content that you want to explore with your audience. At the other end of the spectrum are narrative shows. So these are generally like a true story across multiple episodes. So the very top one, Serial. Hands up if you've listened to Serial. Cool, quite a lot of you. And Ghost Story. Has anyone listened to that? That was like my favorite show of this year. If you haven't listened to it, or like last year, you should listen to that. So one story across multiple episodes, and they both did massively well. And then you've got Cheat, which is something I made for Sony Music and something else, which was under the umbrella of, is it okay to cheat? What does it take to cheat? Who cheats? Could you cheat? We had an episodic format. So one episode I made was about the cheating in Formula One, like how did very confidential documents make their way between teams. Another one was about a boxer who took the padding out of his gloves. Another one was about wine fraud. Like they vary massively, but they all come under the umbrella of like cheating, this common theme. And generally narrative podcasts are narrators cut up with bits of tape around them, sound effects, sound design, music, and so on. Let me grab some water. Now, other than these, you've got a lot of other formats. I'll just whiz through a couple. Panel shows, documentaries, single narrators, video podcasts, which I generally put in their own category because I think they are a different beast. And often shows like this get made into video podcasts, your chatty shows, because they're quite easy to film, quite easy to cut, quite easy to consume visually. Shows like this, not so much. But just a side note, I do think the text-to-video AI softwares could actually be a really interesting thing to explore with narrative podcasts, but we don't have time for that. Okay. Here are some of my favorite shows. And I'm going to play you a clip from some of these. They do something really great with formats. So, Love and Radio on the very top left. On the face of it is an interview podcast. One guest who is interviewed by the host, Nick. And that's kind of straightforward. There's like a million podcasts out there like it. But Love and Radio is different because of like this immersive sound design. Like it is truly beautiful. It is an entire sound world. And that's what sets it apart from every other interview podcast you will hear. Like Desert Island Discs, I often don't know who the guest is, but I will listen because I know the type of stories that Love and Radio go for. And I also know what it's going to sound like. So the format is what brings me back. I'm going to play, I think it's a 2-minute clip from Love and Radio. It's a draft, so I'm working on their latest series. It's the very first time they've done a proper narrative series. So we're doing 6 episodes, and it's about a UK television show from the early 2000s, which was basically a bit of a Truman Show. And the ethics of that are very questionable. And we explored it with all the original cast and producers and set designers and so on. But this is an early draft, so all the sound design isn't in there yet, and it's a little messy, but you'll be able to hear a bit of what we were doing. Give it a second.
I was living in a flat with a boyfriend at the time, and I'd been given a week's notice for this job. So I just said to him, look, I'm off to do a job. I'm going to go and live in somewhere else for 6 months. I won't be back. Can't tell you where I'm going or what I'm doing. And I don't think that was very popular. Let's just say the relationship didn't last.
Were you ever tempted to tell other people?
There's a slight buzz about not being able to tell. It makes you feel a bit like, oh, I got this really special secret. I am B. Christie, and I am an art director. I'm not actually an art director anymore, but I was all through my 20s and early 30s, mainly working on reality-type TV shows in the UK.
And how did you get involved with Space Cadets?
I ended up working on Space Cadets because I worked with a production designer.
Hiya.
Called Patrick.
Yeah, I production design, mainly for sort of light entertainment.
And we did lots of jobs together.
Yeah, TV, game shows.
And he got offered the job to work on Space Cadets and design the sets.
So I was working on Big Brother.
Okay, welcome back to the launch night of Big Brother.
Yesterday, Big Brother set the housemates their first weekly task.
You must now choose one person who you believe does not deserve to receive their suitcase.
And they just called me in for a meeting in their office and took me into their kind of small back room and told me about the format and asked me if I was up for it.
He had a very secret job he was working on, and he couldn't tell me anything about it. That was quite unusual because we worked on most things together. Obviously, that made me very curious and frustrated that he wouldn't share it.
It just took me some time to really understand what they were trying to do. It's not reality, it's not game show, but it's very much those two worlds meeting.
And eventually I got called in and I had to sign a disclosure saying I wouldn't talk about it, and then I got told about the job.
What they want to do is create a Russian space agency site and put them through a training period to become astronauts. And they told me that they are trying to trick these people into thinking they're going into space.
It seemed unlike anything else we'd ever worked on, really.
So what we did with the entire series is we had no narrator and we patched together maybe 20 different interviews with different people so that they kind of told their stories as a collective memory, and that's very like Love and Radio-esque. Anthems is a UK production, and it could have been a chat show. It could have been an interview where the host got a guest on and said, can you talk about love? Can you talk about what it is to be a woman? But instead what they did is they asked each guest to prepare an essay, a manifesto, a poem on one like specific word. So you end up with this anthology of podcasts titled with one word, and people can go in and listen to something on that theme. Decode does something similar to Anthems. They don't pick the predictable format. They don't pick what most listeners would expect to hear or the easy way to do something. I think Decode do something very difficult, which is and I'll explain it in a second, but they break down an album. And I feel like a lot of people would say, oh, if you're going to break down an album, let's just get a host who can ask the person who made the album or the people who made the album to break it down. Like, what did you mean by this line? What is the album about? Like, what was your thought here? But instead what they did was they created a narrative show, and it required a lot more production, but it's almost as like immersive as the music itself. So here you go. Oh, wait. I just realized that's not the right clip, so let me it's playing the bottom one, so let me explain the bottom one. The bottom clip, again, is like a similar thing. It's an interview, but what they do, it's an American podcast, is the host lets you in on their internal monologue and also shows you the behind the scenes of their search for this answer that the guest has posed them. It, again, is one of my favorite podcasts and I think is really cleverly done, but we don't often get to hear the host in pursuit of something and all the behind the scenes and things going wrong. So, again, quite a surprising format.
Hello?
Hi, is this Lachlan?
Hello?
Hello, can you hear me?
Hello?
Despite his lack of confirmation, this is indeed Lachlan, or Locke for short. Hi, it's Kalila calling. How are you?
Oh, hi, how are you?
Locke is 20 years old. When I ask him what he does, he says he plants trees. But also he's traveling. But also he's kind of a student. He's a disorienting person to talk to. Like, despite the fact that we exchanged multiple emails setting up this call.
I'll be honest, I did forget that that was today, but yeah.
And in fact, it's Locke's questionable memory that we're here to talk about today. Because he's come to me with an improbable story. Something he recalls vividly, but that no one else believes actually happened. In revisiting this memory, Locke hopes to expose an injustice, to unseat a tyrant, to confront a nemesis he's obsessed over since he was just 5 years old.
Madame Nicole.
Madame Nicole, Locke's kindergarten French immersion teacher.
She wore like mean-looking glasses, and she kind of scowled all the time.
Locke describes her as an exact double of Edna Mode from The Incredibles.
That's exactly what she looks like. Really tiny, short black hair, like cut off really sharply, like a 90-degree angle. And she like would just kind of walk around and like do mean shit all the time.
But what set her apart from your garden variety evil French teacher was one particular habit. According to Locke, Madame Nicole was a thief, a cheese thief. Madame Nicole stole cheese from her 5-year-old students.
Sometimes I would just walk into class, and it was like before she'd start the lesson, it was just like, oh, do you have cheese today? And I'd say, yeah, so she'd take it. You're kind of never safe. Like sometimes if I was in trouble, then she would like, it would be a punishment. She'd like take my cheese as punishment, but it's hardly a punishment because she was gonna do it anyway. She didn't even refrigerate it. She would put it in this cabinet, like in a little wooden cabinet, and it had a padlock on it. Like as.
So the host now will go off and try and get in contact with this teacher, talk to everyone Locke knows, and try to figure out if she actually did steal cheese from 5-year-olds. It's like it's a very surprising listen. This episode makes me laugh every time. But it's funny because like the guest comes to her and he's like, nobody believes me that my kindergarten teacher used to steal cheese, and he feels like really traumatized because everybody's like, that never happened. His brother's like, that never happened. So you should go and listen to that. I think it's so funny. Great. So these are some formats in audio that I think are great, but what I like to do, and the reason I showed you some of the shows that I make earlier, was to show you that it's really important to work in different genres. Like I will make chat shows, I will make podcasts, I will make sleep stories, I will make audio dramas, and I'll also make video podcasts, because I think each of, like working in an audio drama gives me an idea, teaches me something really exciting that I can then bring to factual podcasting. And it works really well. It surprises the audience, and I feel like it pushes factual podcasting forward. It gives the audience something that they haven't heard before. So I strongly recommend, when I joined audio, people always said to me, like, you have to pick one or the other, like narrative or entertainment. And that's part of the reason I stayed freelance, because I didn't want to do that. And I think it does benefit your work in any medium. So with that in mind, I'm going to show you some formats outside of audio, because it's important that you look at newspaper columns, read books, go to art galleries, like see how they lay things out in different places. Like even billboards can be really exciting. So we are going to look at, oh, this is the clip I wanted to play you earlier. This is good too.
A samurai who has no master is called a ronin. Ronin, roughly translated, is drifter. Legend has it, the Ronin's doomed to wander in penance for an earlier disgrace, and through this wandering recover inner strength. He's not a hungry young apprentice. He's been around and is now at the crossroads of life, trying to find the courage to choose the right path. But the Ronin can still face battle with the agility of a younger warrior. Now listen to the opening of Konnichiwa, the 2016 LP by London MC producer Skepta. The instrumentation is East Asian. A flash of a blade sends us back to medieval Japan, realm of the samurai.
Looking for me.
Konnichiwa. Hello. Good afternoon.
Okay, I won't play the whole clip in the interest of time. Sorry, I have a memory like a sieve, so I forgot that we hadn't listened to that clip. But yeah, so what they did with that clip is they turned something that could have been a chat podcast into a narrative podcast. And as you heard, really beautifully sound designed and told like a story. Now, on to YouTube YouTube formats. The very top one is pretty simple, kind of like Love and Radio. It's an interview show, right? But here, they do exactly the same interview every single year. So you end up with, I don't know how many they've done now, maybe like 8, with Billie Eilish. And what we see is her growth over time. So on the face of it, kind of a boring format, like one interview. But when you do it 8 times with the same person over 8 years, you suddenly have this record of their growth. And that's like a great long-term kind of format that they've done. And then on the bottom, this is like Architectural Digest Open Door. It's kind of like a chic MTV Cribs. And what happens is a generally silent cameraman is invited into the homes of celebrities. The celebrity shows you around. And it feels like, because they're talking to the camera, it feels like they're talking to the audience. And it's a format that all they have to do is swap out the people involved. And we know exactly what's going to happen. We're going to get invited in. They're going to tell us stories about their home and show us around, where they got stuff from, architecture, blah, blah, blah. Now, what I'm going to show you is a video clip from TikTok. This creator puts out a number of... this is not... OK, we'll check. A number of videos on the same kind of theme. So she will go and review bathrooms. And I know that sounds like kind of weird, but it's a very formal format. You've got reviews. They do restaurant reviews. They do reviews of like anything. And on the face of it, kind of boring. But her kind of quirky, silly edits, plus the topic at hand, which is like, how nice is this bathroom, has amassed like millions and millions and millions of views, followers and likes, and people come back because they're like, oh, I wonder what the bathroom at Hermes looks like. I wonder what the bathroom here looks like. And she takes us in and she shows us. Let's see if this works.
Me at Hermes. There's nothing like a store made for billionaires to make you feel out of place. So I went straight to my safe place. Jump scare coming up. Mrs. Meyer soap straight from Target. Try your best to look past the hand soap because the energy in here is definitely Hermes. I accidentally forgot my Kelly at home. Slight redemption here for having a Toto, but this toilet paper brings us right back down. My jaw dropped when I felt how thin this was. Vanity was incredibly clean. Nothing in the automatic soap dispenser, so I did have to use Mrs. Meyer's. Toto sink as well, and standard paper towels. I give it a 4 out of 5. It was incredibly clean. Where should we shit next? Come take a shit.
Yeah. So I think here what makes it special is like the juxtaposition of a very serious format with something that's kind of like totally ridiculous. And yet we all kind of want to know how good the toilets at these like really nice places are. And you can see that it gets like 2 million likes. And I think I screen recorded this fairly early, so it's amassed like a lot more since then. So, in summary, it's important that you spend a good amount of time developing the idea for your show. And talking about how you do that would take like another hour, so we won't. But I see that neglected most often, is people are like, oh, I don't have time. I've got the idea, let's go and record. Actually, it doesn't take a day to develop a show. It takes a long time. We need to sit down. We need to look at competitors. We need to look at what audience you're going for. What formats do they like? What do they know about the topic? What are they curious about the topic? What don't they want to know? What media do they consume outside of audio? We need to know a lot of stuff in order for us to figure out what the best format is to package this up in and give to them. Formats help your show stand out. There is a lot of sameness in audio, and that's not to say there aren't some really great shows out there. There are, but there is a lot of sameness. So a format can be the thing that makes people remember your show. Like, people know Desert Island Discs, even if they're not from the UK, because it's like a very recognizable format. And finally, if you want to create, you have to consume. That doesn't mean you need to listen to like 10 hours of audio a day. It means that you need to regularly go out to places like exhibitions, watch YouTube, listen to podcasts, look at formats in other places. Because if you are never the listener, if you are never the consumer, it is very hard to put yourself in their shoes and make something for them. You're going to miss the mark entirely. So it's important to consume what they consume, when they consume it, how they consume it, so you can fully understand the experience that they kind of consume all this content within. That's everything. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Meera. And if anyone has a question for Meera or wondering something about formats, save them for later. We will have a Q&A after 2 more speakers. The next speaker is Norma Belenky. Welcome. She is from the US, but lives in Indonesia/Rome.
I guess so,
right?
yeah. I'm remote.
Yeah. And you work for Podbean.
For Podbean.
Yeah, which is a tool that publishes podcasts.
Amongst other things.
Amongst other
yes.
things. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I've got about 20 minutes, is that right? Okay, so thanks everyone for being here today. As was mentioned, my name is Norma Jean Belenky. I'm with Podbean. No, I hit next. Are we? No, I've hit next on. Oh, okay. There's me. There's a little about me. And today we're going to talk about a few things. So as Meera mentioned, and there's been a lot of really amazing speakers so far talking about making great content. And once you have that great content, once you've developed your audience with all the tools that Arielle gave you, you want to monetize. And so there's a lot of different ways to monetize, and today we're going to talk all about ads. And a really interesting aspect of podcasting is that nobody gets into narrative storytelling and podcasting because they want to learn about ad tech. So we're going to do that today, which is really exciting. And there's a couple nuances, but there's also a lot of terms. And so if you're on the content side, if you're on the ad side, if you're from maybe a radio background, there's some terms that are thrown around. And so a lot of my role at Podbean is education, right? We want to really empower everybody to know the landscape of podcast advertising. We have a lot of solutions built in at Podbean. And so it's something where we really want to educate everybody on the different formats of ads, how to make the best ads for your podcast, and to really successfully monetize your show because you'd be able to keep making it. So today's learning objectives, we're going to talk about the different types of podcast ads. We're going to talk about tailoring your advertising strategy to match your podcast's unique style, brand identity, and the target demographics of your podcast, which is really important. We're going to go over some key metrics and terms, and then insights into best practices and strategies for crafting ads and ad scripts. So it's kind of a bit of an overview. Also, I'll have a QR code at the end with some free resources and a copy of this presentation. So it's quite thorough. Buckle in, but don't feel like you have to memorize anything. Okay, so Podbean, as I mentioned, we're a podcast software and monetization company. We've been around since 2006. I think Maria this morning was saying podcasting's been around for more than 8 years, and it definitely has. On the public side, we host over 640,000 podcasts. So there's a lot of podcasts in the world, and we're really grateful and lucky that people choose us. We have a lot of monetization built in, including DAI, which I'll go into. And we just launched an AI. We're living in the future. I love it. It's very exciting. It'll write all your show notes, but that's something else. So podcast advertising is growing, as we've seen a little bit today so far. This year, it's projected to hit $4 billion US, which is pretty exciting. By 2027, the ad market is projected to have over 616 million users and reach over $5 billion US. In Europe specifically, we're looking at just under 450 million US this year, and projected listeners of almost 90 million by 2027. And in Germany specifically, where we are today, we're looking at projected revenue of just over 40 million this year, which is pretty exciting. So there's a few different types of ads, right? The first is baked in ads. And that's an ad that's part of the episode audio file. So if you're on the content creation team and you create an ad as part of your podcast show, it's baked in and you can't change it. It becomes part of the audio of the episode. The next is DAI, or dynamic ad insertion. I love DAI. I can talk about it all day, every day, and we're going to talk about it maybe a third today. So DAI ads are inserted separately as audio files into your RSS feed in real time. And so you can manage this through different software. We have it at Podbean. A lot of different companies have it, and it can be changed without impacting the episode file, which is really important. So for a lot of podcasts that are maybe 1, 2, 3 seasons deep, right? We have podcasts with us at Podbean that are over 10 years deep. They can insert fresh ads into their entire back catalog, which is a game changer in terms of monetization. Additionally, on the format side, we've got host read, which is obviously read by the host of the podcast, and announcer read, which is read separately by another party and inserted into the podcast. So that's a little bit of Podcast Ads 101. And the evolution of podcast advertising tech, we've kind of been through this like technological, I don't know which way is forward. Maybe this way is forward. We've been through like a technological evolution, right? In terms of how the technology has advanced and developed for podcast advertising. So like I mentioned, baked in ads at the very, very beginning of podcasting, that's what was available, right? And it's still a popular format today. Baked in ads are, as I mentioned, part of the episode audio. You're not able to change them. So if you have a baked in ad from 2010 in your podcast for a product that no longer exists, you're going to have to pull that episode down and re-edit it and re-upload that episode to get that ad out of there. Then we have DAI, like I mentioned. It's inserted at specific ad markers. You can control for audience and time, and you can monetize your entire back catalog. Now we're in the age of programmatic, which is really exciting. It's an expansion on DAI, and we're going to get into the technicality of it later, but it's basically where a DSP talks to an SSP and servers communicate in computer world. And ads are served in near real time based on the demographics of your audience. From a content creator or a network standpoint, you don't even hear or see the ad. It's inserted in real time. So in terms of the ad strategy for you and your podcast and your portfolio of properties or your podcast network, there's several different strategies that you can implement, right? The first is sponsorship. You have a direct relationship with a brand or a product, and you go up to them and you say, hey, we want to monetize. We love your show. They say, we love your show. You say, hey, we love your product. And so you have a direct relationship, right? It's really helpful for smaller podcasts that want to have a direct relationship with a product that maybe aren't ready to start monetizing in regard to impressions, or who have a really fanatical niche. It's also helpful on a larger scale in terms of content creation, but that's a little bit of a separate beast. We also have marketplace. So at Podbean, we have an ads marketplace. There's a few ad marketplaces out there, and marketplaces are great if you're getting 10,000 plus downloads a month. It allows for monetization of your back catalog, and you can geofence and target your audience. Additionally, we have programmatic. Like I mentioned, it's the easiest way to match your ads to your audience. You don't see them coming in. You don't manage them. Once your programmatic is set up, the DSP and the SSPs talk to each other, and I'll get into what all those acronyms mean. Generally, programmatic has a lower CPM, which means a lower cost per 1,000 impressions, which I'll get into that term as well down the line. But it has a broader appeal to brands because they can specifically target demographics and they can control the content. Okay, so some best practices for direct sponsorship are put it in writing, right? Make sure you have a clear contract. Use really simple rates. So set your pricing on a per episode basis or a time duration, right? Hey, I'm gonna promote your product for a month on my show. Every episode, you're gonna get a 60-second slot, or you're gonna get 2 60-second slots, that kind of thing. Package your shows. And I think Arielle spoke about this a little bit in terms of the marketing of your show, but when you're connecting with advertisers and you're connecting with sponsors of your show, include them in your newsletter, include them in your social, include them in your communication that promotes your show. Because you can say, hey, this brand or this company or this product is helping make the show possible. We just wanna tell you about it. And for the brand, maybe you don't have the downloads that they're looking for directly from the podcast, but your newsletter subscriber base does, or your social media following does. So it's important to think about packaging your sponsorships so that you can have a greater impact, and implement DAI as well. So you can offer them, like I mentioned, a time duration basis, and you can insert those ads for the time that you've committed to. Ad marketplace best practices and best practices here are you want to make sure that you optimize your category selection. Just make sure you're clear on what your podcast is about, what categories you fall into. You want to make sure that you integrate your existing partnerships. So if you have sponsorships, you want to make sure you include those, and so you keep open the available slots for additional advertisers to come in through a marketplace. You want to curate ad content that enhances your narrative. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit and just kind of like sprinkled throughout, but the listening experience of your audience is paramount. Because if you don't retain them, you're not going to have the metrics you're not going to have the downloads that are going to be monetizable. So that's really important. And be consistent, right? You want to make sure that you generally release new episodes of your show on a consistent and regular basis so that you have content to monetize. So some ad lingo explained. CPM, like I mentioned, is a cost per 1,000 impressions. So people a lot of the time are going to throw around terms, $25 per CPM, $30 per CPM, $45 per CPM, $10 per CPM, and it's French for cost per mille, which is like per 1,000. So when we're talking about how ad impressions are measured, that's the most common term, and that's what it means. In terms of ad positions, we've got pre-roll, which runs before the show, mid-roll anytime after the show starts, and post-rolls after the episode. And ad marker is the designated timestamp. Frequency cap is how many times each listener will hear a specific ad. So you can set your frequency cap to maybe 7. I don't know about you guys, but pretty much everybody I know will find a podcast they love and just binge, right? So when you do that and you set a frequency cap, your listeners aren't gonna, anybody who's found your show and is like 10 episodes deep in a week, they've found you, you're their soulmate podcast, it's amazing. They're only gonna hear that ad 7 times, so they're not gonna get oversaturated and your advertiser's not gonna waste budget. We also have ad pacing, so that's important as well when we're talking about optimizing budget across a period of time. Okay, so some of the ABCs of programmatic are SSP, which is a supply side provider. And that's really going to be the podcast side of it, right? SSPs are the podcast side. So it's the platform where the podcasts are that enable publishers to connect with multiple ad exchanges. So at Podbean, we have our programmatic, basically our big ad team has relationships with brands and agencies. And so when they want to purchase advertising, we have the inventory, but it's based on demographics. It's not necessarily based on a specific show. Additionally, the demand side provider is going to be that request from the advertiser to place an ad in the podcast. And this happens in microseconds. It happens in near real time. When you're listening to a podcast and a programmatic ad is served, you can't hear when it's inserted. It's that quick. And it's based on the demographics of the listener. So that's pretty clear. So some ad best practices for programmatic are to make sure that your podcast meets brand safety standards. This is pretty common. I think we have a lot of folks in here from public radio or who have a radio background. So making sure that you fall within those brand safety standards is pretty common. But if you're from an independent network, you're an independent creator, you want to make sure that your content's clean and that you align with the brand safety standards of any specific brands that you want to work with, right? So maybe you do have a provocative show, but there's brands out there that want to reach that audience. That's okay too. You want to make sure to monetize your entire back catalog. Like I mentioned at Podbean, we have a lot of podcasts that have been with us, 5, 10 years. And so when we're looking at an entire back catalog, you want to make sure that you select all those episodes. Strategically select your ad slots. So when somebody's listening, it's not awkward and doesn't cut in at a weird point. And you want to check in on your progress. Check in with your ad team on a regular basis just to make sure that they're happy, you're happy, and everything is going well in terms of progress, revenue, and audience engagement. Okay, so now I want to talk about tailoring your ad strategy. So now we all have a little bit of background on ads, how they work, what some terms are. So in terms of tailoring your ad strategy, the first thing you want to make sure is that you identify your podcast's unique style and tone. There's nothing worse than listening to a podcast and being really immersed in the experience. Like when Meera played that 2-minute clip about the kindergarten teacher that stole the cheese, right? You're in it, you're like, oh, that teacher, she stole those kids' cheese. And then you hear an ad that just doesn't resonate. And so it's really important to identify the tone of your show, the style of your show, and to tailor the ads to that tone of your show. Is your show comedic? Is it professional? Is it a news show? Is it informative? These are all really important aspects. And to think of your target demographics and preferences. What is your listener going to want to hear in regard to an ad? Aligning formats with your show's content and brand identity. So you want to choose an ad format that complements your podcast flow and tone, right? So maybe programmatic isn't right for some of your properties or some of your shows within your podcast network. Maybe it's something where host read works out better, and that personal recommendation and that personal experience of the host with the product is really what's going to make the difference in terms of what the goal of those advertising campaigns are. Additionally, balancing monetization goals with listener experience and engagement. You do not want to alienate your listeners. I cannot say this enough, and I will continue to say it through my presentation. Okay, so in terms of crafting advertising creative, it's really important to develop compelling ad scripts that resonate with your audience and align with your podcast tone and style. Now, if you're on the programmatic side and you've signed up for programmatic, or you guys are within a programmatic database, it's going to be something where you don't have control of that creative, and that's okay. But if you're working with any kind of direct sponsorship, any kind of host-read ads, anything relational with a sponsor, it's really important to consider how you make that creative. You want to make sure that you have an overarching theme. The atmosphere of your podcast is consistent with the ads. You tailor the ad delivery. and that you use storytelling techniques and music that goes with the show. So a lot of the time, if you're hearing something that's host read within a podcast, it'll have maybe music that is from the show or similar to the show, or it'll have music from the brand, and the brand has a similar tone to the show as well. So here's an example. We're going to listen to an example of an ad that won an ads contest at Podbean. We had a contest for our ads marketplace for some of our podcasters to make an ad for our ads marketplace. And this was one of the winners. So things you want to listen for when we're going to listen to this ad together are making sure that it has a captivating introduction. There's a compelling offer there, and there's a really clear call to action. This is really important when we're talking about podcast ads, because you want to make sure that they have the impact and you hit the metrics and the goals, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But you want to make sure that you leave a contact information or a link. So we're going to play this ad, and the transcript is just here at the bottom for anybody who wants to read along.
Hear ye, citizens of the internet. Podcast advertising is one of the best ways to advertise your product or service. Right now, thousands of people could be hearing your ad. Go to podbean.com/brands and start boosting your business today. Podbean advertising. It's nothing to cry about, but something to shout about.
So as you can see here, right, there's an attention grabbing, hear ye, there's a really compelling offer, and there's a clear call to action. That URL is there at the bottom, and you can get in contact. So that's one of the ads that won our contest here. We're gonna skip over the second one, because I think we're out of time. And I have some sample, in terms of time, you wanna, I think I'm over time. I'm getting the signal, that's why I'm rushing through. But in terms of how you want to structure each ad based on the time, we have, different metrics and protocol for the different length of the ad. So 15 seconds, 30 seconds, and 60 seconds. 15 is going to be really concise, really based on brand lift. 30 seconds is going to allow for a bit more detail, present a problem, present a solution. And 60 seconds is really going to be that narrative arc. So we have a couple of sample scripts here that we're going to breeze through. And in terms of markers of success, the things you want to look out for in terms of the goal of your campaign are impressions, the number of times the ad's played, reach, the total number of listeners, which is different, right? Because we've all binged a show, and conversion, which is did they subscribe, did they follow, did they buy the product? Some metrics are pixels, reference URLs or ad tracking URLs, and cost per acquisition. So that's the total campaign divided by the number of conversions. So in terms of podcast networks, here are some key takeaways if you're from a network or a public radio station. You want to make sure that you diversify revenue streams. You want to make sure that you have network-wide sponsorships. So it's across multiple shows, premium content offerings outside of advertising, right? Exclusives, behind the scenes, and cross-promotional opportunities, which is a little bit of what Arielle spoke about, which is making sure that you promote your podcast across each other. So if you want a copy of this PowerPoint, here is a QR code, and there's also some free resources. We've got an ad cheat sheet with a lot of these terms, because I feel like there's also a little bit of a stigma if you don't know what an acronym is, right, in podcasting. So we've got that cheat sheet for you, and we have a host-read ad checklist. So if anybody has any questions there, scan the code, pop in your email, and we'll send that off to you. Thanks. Sorry, I got through as quick as I could.
It's fine, it's fine. Thank you so much, Norma. We are a little bit over time, but I hope everyone's all right with that. Next speaker is Andrew. Come to the stage, all the way from Australia and ABC. Welcome.
Thanks, Remi. Thank you. I'm just going to move this water because I tend to move my hands, so it could be dangerous. How are we all doing? It's 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Are we feeling kind of energized, engaged? Yeah, everyone having a good Radiodays? Good. I flew in yesterday, so I've had a few coffees. So if I feel like I'm kind of talking quickly, that might be the caffeine talking. I'm going to... Oh, my slides are up, which is great. So I'm going to talk for the next 20 minutes about Quick Smart, which is a new short-form podcast that the ABC developed last year. And for those of you who don't know, the ABC is the Australian public broadcaster, so the equivalent of the BBC, NRK, CBC, etc. So just some context, in Australia, most of the podcast listening is to longer shows. So shows that are 30 minutes or so, both digital first and catch-up shows. We do have some shorter form shows. So by shorter form, we mean probably under 15 minutes or 10 minutes. Our news team produced 2 shows that are in that category. So we have some history of shorter form shows in the ABC, but they're predominantly news shows. So what's different about this show is it was not about news, and that was why it was different, something we wanted to try. So we did an experiment a couple of years ago, not quite that old, but I did like the photo, a couple of years ago that was very much around understanding the needs of people when it comes to listening to short form audio. So the ABC has an innovation lab team, which is an innovation team. They help work with content areas on particular projects. And we did well, it was about a year ago, we did a project looking at short-form audio and how short-form audio resonates with users. So in other words, why would they listen? What is it about shorter-form audio they might like? And I guess the broader needs overall. And I was also interested in the potential of developing a show in this space. So I was interested in to see whether there was potential for a show that was not a news explainer podcast, but something a bit different from that. So that gives some context about kind of what we did. I was also interested in the potential around Radio National. So Radio National is the ABC Specialist Speech and Talks Network, which is equivalent to BBC Radio 4, for those of you who know that. And the key genre areas for Radio National are things like science, health, religion, ethics, and society and culture and art. So those are the key genres that we were interested in. And what we did with this experiment was we focused on a particular show from Radio National called This Working Life, which is basically a show looking at psychology and well-being and the workplace. And we recorded 2 pilots based on that episode. One was more presenter-led, so essentially the presenter doing a short-form version of that episode with audio grabs. And one was more of a Q&A style, essentially, where the presenter of that show was being interviewed, and it was more of a Q&A and sort of more energy to that format. And essentially there were 2 8-minute versions of that, those episodes. The call to action at the end of both of those episodes was to listen to the full episode of This Working Life, and the content for that episode was around the idea of imposter syndrome, for those of you who are familiar with that term. And what we did was we then played both pilots to a focus group. So we were really interested to get a sense of those core questions I talked about. And the findings from the focus group were pretty interesting. This is what they were, and the focus group was made up of both ABC audiences and non-ABC audiences, I should say, so not traditional ABC audiences. I won't go through everything on the screen there, but you can see some of the key findings. So participants really liked the energy of the Q&A format rather than the presenter-led version of the show. The other consistent feedback was around making introductions clear and really stating the purpose of the show and the episode really quickly, because you only had 8 minutes to play with. Also, you have less time to hook in listeners, clearly in 8 minutes, so it was really important to be clear and simple with the scripting and the style. That was the other feedback that really came through from the focus groups. And also the other feedback that I was interested in was about too many voices, guests and concepts in that short space of time. People have a lot to take in 8 minutes, so that was consistent feedback in both versions of the show, but particularly in the first version. And the other thing that I wanted to think about was the workflow, because I was interested to see if this show did work, what was the workflow involved. So that wasn't a question for the focus group, but that was a question for our innovation team to understand the workflows to see how that might work. So that was the result of the key findings of the pilots. The next stage was really thinking about, I'll come back to this slide in a second, was really thinking about taking inspiration from that process and really the fact that there was that strong interest in the Q&A version of the show. And also the feedback about the format being useful for people being introduced to new and interesting topics, which was on the previous slide. Those are things that really came through from the process. And I should also say that part of the inspiration for this thinking was also a show from the BBC called 5 Minutes On. I don't know if Nikki Birch is in the room, maybe she isn't. She's the head of the innovation and new formats team at BBC Sound. So that was an inspiration for us in that show, because it wasn't about just news topics per se. So we were interested to see, as I say, if there was interest in this more generalist show. So we did some further audience research, and that really highlighted that there was a gap for an always-on show focused on explaining ideas and issues that weren't as closely aligned to the news cycle. And you can see on the slide behind me the growth in podcasts in the Australian market in the last 12 months. It's really competitive. In the daily daily news podcast Explainer space, there are now 10 shows. So we clearly didn't want this show to replicate what we were already doing in that space. We have an existing show called ABC News Daily, which is run by my colleagues in our news team. This show would sit differently to that. The target audience for this show that we really thought about as a result of thinking further about market research was younger women, particularly 30 to 45. It's the ABC, so younger is not necessarily 20 in our case. But that said, it was really a really key area of focus for us, and we thought that there's a real gap there because we're underserving that audience in radio, and we're underserving that audience across some of our podcast offering as well. And we also wanted to offer a further showcase to platform, as I say, or to focus or give a platform to Radio National's genre expertise, but in an accessible, entertaining, and hopefully clever way. And while the focus was on creating a digital-first podcast, we weren't ignoring the radio as well. So one of the considerations was if we created a show like this that was kind of more modular, would it also work on the radio? Would it also work on the website? Would it also work to be embedded in articles and those kinds of things? So that was a key part of the process in thinking about the show. And then the next stage of the process, which was the development process, which is where you keep calm and create, or you try to. And I think the slide that Matthieu showed earlier on talked about audience need states, and from memory, the two most popular that he showed were learn something new and enjoyment and entertainment, which are also the two most popular need states for podcasts in Australia. So we really wanted to meet both of those need states with this show. And we also knew we wanted the show to be a satisfying and self-contained experience and not just be judged on referrals to other shows. But having said that, we did want to draw in the audience to the broader ABC and Radio National ecosystem when it came to the topics and the talent that were focused. We also knew we needed a presenter who was in the same target demographic as the audience, which is really important, but someone who could also act as the audience proxy, if you know what I mean. So ask the questions that the audience wanted asked. And we also wanted a name for the show that clearly signalled it was short, but also hopefully fun. And that's where we got to with the name of the show, which is Quicksmart. And that's the podcast tile on the right. I won't go through everything in here, but this is the production team. So on the left is Tegan Taylor, who's the presenter of the show. She's a really popular presenter of a number of health shows for the ABC. She's in the same target demographic as the audience, which is really important. She's got a great range and style and tone, and she really gets podcasting. And she's also importantly keen to branch out beyond the health genre. So this was an opportunity for us to further develop her skills and give her something else to focus on beyond the health space. On the right, top right, is Cara Jensen-McKinnon. She's the producer of the show. She's a really talented producer. She's got a very strong background in single-topic daily explainer shows, but unusually also a comedy background, which I loved. So we really wanted someone with a comedy background that brought something different to the show. She's also in the same target demographic as the audience. Person at the bottom, clearly not in the target demographic, but he is the sound engineer for the show, a really important person, David White, who's been a really core part of the process. So it's a great team, been very involved since the beginning. And the piloting process really focused on a few things, which will be familiar to many of you who've worked on developing shows of all kinds. So it was really about workflows, introductions, the setups. Meera gave a great presentation about formats. The format was really important for this show. And also taking the time to come up with a 10-word description for the show. Some of you might be familiar with this. Eric Nuzum, who some of you might know, spoke at Radiodays Europe last year. He's a very well-known US audio creative. He wrote a great book called Make Noise a few years ago, and he talked about coming up with a 10-word description that really explains what your show is and solves a problem for the audience. So we really wanted the team to come up with a 10-word description that really summarised what this show is and was and what it's doing for the audience. And we also wanted to find a balance between attribution, so establishing the credibility of guests at the same time as not being a promotional vehicle just purely for those shows. And the other thing that was most important with the piloting process was short form. So I talked about short form audio. Well, how short is short? In this case, 10 minutes. So that was the key thing that came out of the focus groups and really focusing on 10 minutes. Some episodes are a bit longer than 10 minutes. Some episodes are a bit shorter than 10 minutes, but 10 minutes is the consistent offer for the audience. So that gives some context to kind of where we got to. I'm going to play you a clip of audio, which hopefully will play.
The technological advances of the 20th century gave us so many things. Antibiotics, spaceflight, and, some would argue just as importantly, extruded, puffed and deep-fried corn, dusted in fluoro-orange powder and lots of salt. For better or worse, ultra-processed foods are the backbone of many people's diets. But much like their effect on our cholesterol, blood pressure and waistlines, the evidence that they do us harm is rapidly increasing. Tegan Taylor, and this is Quick Smart, the show that feeds you big ideas in bite-sized pieces. So, where did these foods come from? Are they bad for us just because they're packed with sugar, fat and salt? Or is there something more at play here? And if they're so very terrible, what would a repackaging of our food landscape in a healthier direction look like? Someone who's been ripping open foil packages in search of an answer is Jen Lee. Hello, Jen.
Hello, Tegan.
So there you go. That was the introduction of a recent episode on ultra-processed foods. You can hear the 10 words. So in this case, the tagline is the show that feeds you big ideas in bite-sized pieces. Very clear introduction. You get to the guest really quickly. You don't overstay the welcome, and you're very clear about the questions that the audience are going to have answers to at the end of 10 minutes. So that's exactly what came through the piloting process. I'll talk about the kind of impact the show's had in a second, but before I do that, oops, sorry. I was quite proud of that slide. I was trying to illustrate efficiency in a kind of interesting, hopefully engaging way, which is very hard to do. So the reason I'm saying this is I'm sure many of you are the same, be it public service or commercial or independent. We don't have limitless funds, so really being efficient with what we're doing is really important. It's a key aim for the ABC, particularly with what we're doing. And it's a key part of the thinking with this show in particular, in the sense that we're already leveraging off the expertise of staff. So a Radio National staff member might have spent 2 weeks, 2 days, or 6 weeks working on a story. So if we can reuse that research, those notes, those scripts in a different context, in a more accessible way, we're really achieving greater impact with what they've done with their work. So that's what I mean by efficiency in the context of this show. This show is also not massively complicated to make in a good way. It's not meant to be. It's meant to be a cheap, always-on show that really punches above its weight. So it's efficient in lots of different ways, but that's really been an important part of the process. And I talked about impact and reach, which hopefully, oops, there we go. So I won't go through all of this stuff, but it launched in June last year. It's had just under 1 million total downloads now. The ABC joined the Australian Triton Ranker in November last year, which is the industry ranker for those of you who've got similar rankers in your countries. Quick Smart's been consistently in the top 100 shows, appearing as high as 85, if not higher. According to Spotify data, which is the only data we have for audience demographics, we don't have that on our own app yet. 59% of the audience are female, 39% male, and the biggest demographics are 35 to 44 and 28 to 34. So we're really hitting the audiences we wanted to hit, albeit it's Spotify, so there's a caveat around a younger user base, but that gives us the best information we've got when it comes to the target demographics. Importantly, there's a strong consistency to the episode downloads, which really shows the repeat and growing audience. Completion rates are really important for me with any show I'm involved with. I'm sure many of you are familiar with that. So because a download tells you someone downloaded the show, but the completion data tells you how far they got through episodes. So I think looking at the two together tell a broader picture. Now this is a shorter show, so obviously it's less of a commitment from the audience, but even so you want to make sure that people are actually getting through the episodes. That's been a really important part of the process. And I talked about efficiency before, so return on investment, not to sound like an economist, but that's also something that's really important with any show we make. In this case, the show costs about $1,400 per episode, Australian to make, puts it very, very low by comparison with many other shows. It's outperforming many of the shows that the content is derived from, which is really interesting. So that's been a really important part of the process. And the final thing to talk about, just quickly, because I'm conscious of time, is learnings. So I think the first thing I can say is we've well and truly proved there's an audience for a generalist show that looks at issues and ideas that's not part of the daily news cycle, which was a bit of a gamble on our part, but we wanted to take that risk. Production, importance of pre-production, piloting, workflows, that's true of any show. This show is no different. Been really important to take that time, particularly the 10-word description. That's been a really important part of the process and really summarising and really being clear what that offer is for the audience. And also there was some scepticism. I think there's a question sometimes internally in large organisations about whether you can walk that line between accessibility and still covering big issues and topics. And this show has shown that you can really do that without dumbing things down, which has been important. And also this is true for a lot of shows, but I think sometimes we forget this, having the production team as part of the same audience that you're trying to reach is really important learning along the way. And a couple other things, I'm conscious of time. Cultural change is a big theme for us at the ABC, particularly with radio teams. I'm sure many of you from the public service have similar questions. And this show's been an important part of that. It's not the only thing we're doing in this space, and we didn't make it just for internal cultural change reasons. But what I mean by that is that it's really shown established radio teams that the way you present things in your radio shows, you can do it in a way like this show, where it's actually engaging and interesting and accessible. And that's not to say that all my radio colleagues are not doing that, but I think it's uneven. And I think the thing I'd say is that a number of the guests on this show are presenters of established radio shows, and they sound way more relaxed on this show than they do on their shows. And a couple of them have realised that and have kind of taken this on board when it comes to the way they present their own shows. Now, again, we didn't make this show just for internal reasons, but that's been one of the benefits that's come from that. And also the range of expertise, as well as with this show particularly. It's been younger voices. It's not just established presenters. We're trying to reach a younger audience in our terms. So having younger voices and different voices from just established presenters has also been really important. And two final things. The ABC Listen app is our owned and operated platform, so the equivalent of BBC Sounds or the other different public media apps or commercial apps. And the most popular need state, audience need state on ABC Listen for most audiences for on demand is learn something new. So that's been a really important part of the process. There's a particular module on the app called Stuff You Should Know or Learn Something New, and this show has formed a mainstay of the content on this app. So that's the story of QuickSmart. I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I'm so sorry, but we don't have time for Q&A. But if anyone has questions, find them or find me, and we get them to talk to you. Very soon there will be Ask the Experts panel here with James Cridland moderating, and with Liam Thompson, Brett Spencer, Arielle, Nissenblatt, and Joanne Sweeney. So please stay and talk to you soon.